Hey, it's 9 a.m. I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our newest webinar, Maryland's Heat Illness Prevention Standard. Are you ready for it? The Chesapeake Region Safety Council is happy to have you all here today. Baby, it might be cold outside, but here at the council, we're talking about heat illness prevention and getting us prepared for the winter months or the warmer months to come. So just a couple housekeeping items I want to review. Throughout this webinar, I'd love for you to use the Q&A feature and the chat. We will take questions at the end. And if for some reason we don't get to all of your questions today, we'll be sure to follow up with you after. This video webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website under chesapeakesc.org, resources, safety webinars. The recording as well as the presentation will both be available in just the next couple of days. And we want you to mark your calendars now for January 24th, 2025. We'll have another free webinar covering impairment. That'll be presented by Chesapeake Region Safety Council's President, Dave Medeiros, and Debbie Jennings, our Traffic Services Director and Special Projects Coordinator. And the link for the webinar registration will be live in just a couple of days. So we look forward to having you there. And as I remind you to add your questions in throughout this webinar, I want to let you know, and sort of related here to the heat illness prevention standard, that the Chesapeake Region Safety Council offers the Whole Worker Health Certificate Program. I'm going to put the link to the courses that apply to that program right here in the chat in just a minute. But the courses that apply to that program are all available for registration now. There's 5 courses. Most of them are just one-day classes, and then there's a 4-day POSH class. They include Whole Worker Health, Ready to Work, Principles of Occupational Safety and Health, Mental Health First Aid Certification, Reasonable Suspicion for Supervisors Trainer course, and finally, Impairment Education and Cannabis Use Workshop. So I'd love for you to learn more about this program. I'll put a link in the chat, and please feel free to reach out to us with any questions about that program as well. So I'd like to introduce Christy Bliss. She's our Director of Training and Consultation, as well as the Director of the Mid-Atlantic OTI Education Center. And I'm going to pass it to Christy so she can introduce our esteemed presenters today. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Kim. And thank you all for coming. It's happy to have you all here on this rainy day here in Baltimore anyway. And what I would like to do is introduce both Kate and Drew to our webinar here. They will be your webinar hosts. So Kate is one of our senior instructors here at Chesapeake Region Safety Council, and she has been in occupational safety and health for about 24 years and plus, so for a while now. And her specialty is indoor quality, air quality, and industrial hygiene. So, and Kate is really big about empowering the workforce through education and mentorship. And if you've not been to one of our classes where she's taught, please come on down, because you can sense her passion when she's teaching for sure. And Kim just mentioned the Whole Worker Health Certificate Program, and she did put that in the chat. Kate is one of our instructors for that program, and that's something that she feels very passionate about as well, where she talks a little bit more about heat stress in one of our classes, the Whole Worker Health Ready for Work class. And so she's a big proponent of what she's going to be speaking about here today, which is why we had her be our speaker. So welcome, Kate. And then our other speaker today is Drew Libanati. And Drew is also a Chesapeake Region Safety Council instructor, but also one of our consultation consultants. And he has been in occupational safety and health for over 20 years. He's also been a part of fire protection and emergency response. And so Drew's going to be bringing, because of his experience there, more of the symptoms of heat stress and awareness. But he is part of as well as an instructor for us. And he also goes out to our facilities and does some of our audits, site audits. And he might have been out on one of your sites, visiting one of your sites and doing your audits for you. But both of them are very well accomplished CSP, CHST type people here. So they are informed and are going to give you a great presentation. And I want to thank you again all for coming, and you're going to get some great information.
Okay, thanks, Christy, for that great introduction of Drew and myself. And welcome everyone this morning to our webinar where we will take a walk through the Maryland Department of Labor's new-ish heat stress standards. So let's get started. So our presenters today, myself, Kate Kavanaugh, and Drew, we're excited to be here. So our agenda for this morning, we're going to really take a deep dive into the standard. So we'll look at the scope, how they define certain items in the standard. We'll look at the components and what you need to get together for your prevention and management plan. We'll talk about heat acclimatization of employees. What are the high heat procedures that are in this standard that you need to develop? And then finally, some requirements for training, for record keeping, and health effects, emergency response, and we should have some time to answer your questions as well. So let's take a little look at why do we need a heat stress standard? I think we probably all know why, but let's take a look at some of the statistics. So these are the heat-related fatalities from 1992 to 2022 in construction and all under industry sectors. This is a very preventable fatality, right? And I really like that the standard is focused on prevention of heat-related illness and not only responding to them, right? So we're trying to bring these numbers down to 0. And then if we look at our country and where people work in outside or outside in the heat, this is just a visual representation of that, right? So pretty much everybody has some type of exposure to working in heat or high heat conditions. Maryland has a heat stress standard. It went into effect on September 30th of this year. And like I was saying earlier, it focuses on preventing heat-related illness. It does join a fair number of states that already have some heat stress standards published: California, Colorado, Minnesota, Oregon, and Washington. And right as of now, we do not have any federal OSHA standards. So anything regarding heat is going to be cited under the general duty clause. There also is a national emphasis program for heat, and that went into effect, I believe, in 2022. Yes, April of 2022. So let's take a look at the scope of Maryland's heat stress standard. It does incorporate everyone who works indoors or outdoors, and it's employers with employees who work indoors or outdoors in an area that measures or exceeds 80 degrees Fahrenheit according to the heat index. And we'll get into what the heat index looks like in a second. There are some exceptions here. The exceptions are for emergency operations, essential services, and incidental exposures that are less than 15 minutes in length. Another exception here would be buildings, structures, and vehicles that have mechanical ventilation or fans that are able to maintain our heat index below 80 degrees. So let's look at some definitions. What is considered emergency operations and essential services? So according to this standard, it involves emergency work that may include law enforcement personnel, medical personnel, fire and rescue, as well as utility and telecom restoration. Then we also have alternate cooling and control measures. You're going to see that a lot in the standard. What does that mean? That means that we're managing heat exposure through either job rotation, it could be ventilation, we could use misting equipment, cooling vests and garments, and or drinking water. So that is just some of the ways that we're going to manage exposure to the heat. What are considered high heat conditions in this standard? High heat conditions, which have special provisions, we'll go through those. High heat conditions are when the heat index equals or exceeds 90 degrees. And let's take a little look at what the heat index is. So the heat index, I am in a room where there is, hold on, sorry. Okay, I might have to do that every 5 minutes or so. Sorry about that. So let's look at the heat index. That is when we have air temperature, we're looking at the temperature and the relative humidity. And here is what this looks like. I'm sure most of you have used this chart at some point, right? We have one for heat, we have one for cold. And what this does is it takes into account the temperature and the relative humidity. So if the temperature outside is 84 degrees and our relative humidity, as it does get here in the summertime, about 85 degrees, we're looking at a heat index, what the temperature actually feels like, of 96 degrees. This is what we're going to use to set our provisions for shade. We're going to look when high heat happens, we have to have some extra provisions in place. And so this is what we're going to use basically to measure everything. The heat index, as you can tell here, has different colors. Those also show us where we need to, what that classification of that hazard is, right? From caution all the way up to danger to extreme danger, and what is that level of effort that we want to make sure that we're keeping tabs on everybody so that we don't have heat illnesses. So let's take some time to look at the management plan, the requirements that are in there for both heat and high heat conditions. So the requirements here have a couple things. We need, as you can imagine, we need a written heat illness prevention and management plan, and we have to monitor the heat index. Monitoring the heat index can be a few different ways. We can use direct measurement. That is required when people are working indoors and there is no mechanical ventilation. We can use local weather reports and look at the temperature and relative humidity from those weather reports, calculate the heat index. And we can also use what I would recommend, honestly, the NIOSH Heat Safety app. So the content, we have to look at the environmental considerations. How are we hydrating everybody? How has everyone been trained in heat-related illness recognition and monitoring, right? A lot of the times with heat illness, we don't realize that it's happening to us. Drew will discuss more about that, but we really do need to monitor each other and encourage each other to take rest, take breaks, drink water. It also will have some provisions in here for emergency response, shade access, how are people resting in the shade, acclimatization, and also high heat procedures. So we'll take a look at each individual part of this content. So if you have your phones nearby, this is the QR code for the NIOSH Heat Safety app. It is, unlike the sound level meter app, this one does accommodate both iPhones and Android operating systems. And while it is not perfect, it will give you heat conditions where you are. Right, so it will give you the heat index, it will give you this caution, warning, or danger. It also has some symptoms, first aid. It's a really great free app that NIOSH puts out for our use. So I hope you will take advantage of that. Acclimatization. So let's talk a little bit about what that means and what we have to write about this. So acclimatization. So a lot of times we can't just go full force when the heat starts rising. And if you're a runner, you've probably know that it takes about 2 weeks to get used to the heat, right? So acclimatization, we're going to have a period of up to 14 days when people are newly exposed or when people are returning after being 7 or more days away. And during that time, we're going to monitor everybody closely for signs of illness. The other thing we're going to do there too is we're going to basically say over those 2 weeks, we're going to gradually increase that level of effort in the heat. We're going to monitor employees for heat-related illness by regular communication. That could be phone, that can be radio, the buddy system, or some type of effective observation. Our written acclimatization schedule, again, we're going to gradually increase the level of effort over 5 to 14 days. We're going to increase that effort a maximum of 20% each day. We can also follow the NIOSH recommendations for acclimatization, and you can also use a combination of gradual introduction and alternative cooling and control measures. So this gives you some flexibility how you're going to acclimatize people. It's up to you to make up that schedule. What is this going to have? So our written acclimatization schedule is going to have a list of employees who need it, the environmental conditions that are present, the anticipated workload, the clothing and PPE considerations, and the use of alternative cooling and control measures. So a lot of the times too, our clothing and our PPE, if people are wearing heavy duty coveralls, if you're wearing a respirator, those are going to add to the heat load of your employee. So you do need to take those into account as well. And NIOSH and ACGIH have some good charts on that. Then our shade access. So shade access has to be outside, it has to be open and exposed to air on at least 3 sides. So you get what my dad used to call the balmy breezes. It's going to be sized for those who need it and such that employees can comfortably sit, store their PPE. If shade is not available, we have to provide cooling and control measures. Water access. So for water, it has to be at no cost to the employee. It has to be close to the work area. And we're looking at 32 ounces per hour per person per day. And this needs to be on site at all times when work is being performed. So high heat procedures, we have our acclimatization, we've got our water. So what happens when the heat starts to rise? High heat procedures, that is when, again, the heat index equals or exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And for those, we're going to have minimum rest periods in our program. So from 90 to 100 degrees, we're looking at 10 minutes of rest every 2 hours. And anything 100 plus, we're looking at 15 minutes an hour. Or we can also follow NIOSH recommendations here. So some things about high heat procedures are rest can be a meal period. Cooling and control is an alternative. It has to be accessible at all times. It has to be documented, and it cannot supersede other requirements in the standard. You also need to have some provisions in here for emergency response. So how are people going to communicate with their supervisor? What are you using for emergency services? How are they getting there? How are we going to respond to signs and symptoms of heat-related illness? How are we going to monitor everyone? And if anything happens, how are we providing care to employees? Then we have some training and record keeping requirements as well. So training is going to be provided to employees and supervisors. Again, it really is important for everyone to be trained so that they can recognize when someone might be showing signs of heat illness. This is going to be done prior to their first heat exposure and annually prior to exposure. So March, April, hopefully it won't be too hot then. We're going to train everyone. And immediately following an incident involving a suspected or confirmed heat illness case. So training is going to be done again prior to first heat exposure, annually prior to heat exposure, and immediately following if there was an incident involving a suspected or confirmed heat illness case. As you can imagine, there's going to be some record keeping and training content here. So this is what the training content outline should be. And it's a good idea to have this written down. I'll show you how this goes. So we're going to have how work and the environment affect heat illness, personal risk factors for heat. Sorry about that. I've got it. Oh, there we go. Okay. Personal risk factors for heat. The importance of acclimatization and water and rest, especially if you know that you're susceptible to heat. The types of heat illnesses, their signs and symptoms, the importance of reporting symptoms to your supervisor immediately, right? For heat, Drew will talk about this, early intervention is key. Employer procedures for communication, for emergency management, and we're going to maintain these training records for 1 year. So before we get into symptoms, the other thing about the training records is you want to have your content in the training records, and we're going to keep those for 1 year. That is our walk through the standard. I will turn it over to Drew for talking about symptoms of heat-related illness, first aid, emergency response. Take it away, Drew.
All righty, thank you very much, Kate. Hi, everybody. One thing I want to reiterate back to what Kate was saying. Prevention is, our biggest tool. If we don't want to have to respond, we don't want to have to monitor people. If we do the right things to prevent this possibility of someone getting into distress, then we're far better as employees, as workers, as companies, and humans in the field. So I definitely want to stress that as much as you understand about response, we definitely need to focus on the prevention side of things as much as we possibly can. So when that doesn't work, we move into how do we recognize problems and what do we do with them and do about them. So a couple of different conditions that someone would become ill when talking about heat stress. The first thing it would be you might encounter things like heat rash in high humidity areas, which of course in the Mid-Atlantic region we have lots of humidity in the summertime. All right, so heat rash could be a sign that, hey, look, we might be going, or that person might be going down that path of heat exhaustion. And heat cramps. Now, cramps is usually a sign of dehydration or lack of hydration, lack of electrolytes. Sometimes people will get cramps when they get home and they sit down for a little while. Sometimes the heat cramps will occur in the workplace. That means it's really bad. You've really dehydrated yourself. All right, so those are some things to look out for. Some other things when we move up the scale to heat exhaustion, which you'll see on the slide there on the left-hand side, someone might be experiencing dizziness, thirst, heavy sweating, nausea, and weakness. Oftentimes these symptoms don't necessarily pop into someone's brain as, well, he looks dizzy or she looks like she's nauseous or whatever. The person might just seem different, all right? And something else Kate mentioned earlier is that people who are in distress don't necessarily recognize that they're in distress right away. It takes someone else. So I definitely want to stress the fact that we need to look out for each other. Supervisors and foremen should be approaching all of their workers on a regular basis and getting a feel for how everyone's doing. If those of you who might be familiar with working in confined spaces, we have an attendant that sits outside of confined space. And one of the things we typically teach the attendant to do is watch out for signs and symptoms of whatever chemical might have been in that vessel that a person is entering. We also look at things like oxygen deficiency and how a person would act or react to not having enough oxygen in the air. So this is the same thing. Coworkers and foremen and supervisors should be looking out for the health of the workers around them when they know this issue could be a problem, such as high heat. You talk to someone in the morning brief, tailgate, whatever. Everybody's like, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing?" You talk to everyone, hear their voice, hear how they talk. You work with people all the time. You know what kind of words they use. You know what their speech patterns are. 6 hours later, the heat's killing everybody. It's just beating on, and we're working hard. We're sweating, and the supervisor should be walking around. Hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. Okay, sounds good. Walked over to somebody else out in the sun. Oh, I'm okay. Well, he was awfully peppy a couple hours ago. Something's different. They're not the same. We might need to do something about this. Those little things like speech patterns and the look in their eyes, how they're acting, reacting, how fast they move compared to what you're used to seeing could very easily be signs that this person's heading down a very negative path. Some other things to look for heat exhaustion would be the color of their skin. All right. And somebody might say they feel like they're ready to faint or have fainted. All right. The next thing that they would encounter if heat exhaustion is not cared for, if we ignore the signs of heat exhaustion, is heat stroke. Now, I will tell you bluntly, if someone is in a condition of heat stroke, they are knocking on death's door. All right, this is very, very bad. Oftentimes, a person who is suffering heat stroke is not sweating anymore. They look red, their clothes might be wet, but their head, their face, their forehead is not sweating anymore, and that is very bad. That means they don't have any fluid left to push out to their skin. The sweat is the mechanism of cooling. We sweat, hopefully a breeze comes by and we get that cooling effect with that moisture on our skin. Well, if we can't sweat anymore, we're in big trouble. Right? This person is probably very confused, very dizzy. One thing that your first aid responders might be able to check on is a person's pulse. You don't need to be a first aid responder to go learn how to check a pulse. You can check a pulse in your neck, on your wrist. Radial and carotid pulses are pretty easy to find. And someone who's got an elevated pulse over 100, 110 beats per minute is probably in distress. If they were just jogging around the site, okay, their heart rate's probably up for a few minutes. But if someone is just casually working, not running, but their heart rate is up just because of the heat, that's a problem. All right. So this is definitely a case where we're going to need to call 911 right away. We might have even called 911 for heat exhaustion if we have no way to properly cool this person down or a place to get them to. If maybe the place we've prepared for just isn't good enough. They're not recovering. Some factors that would cause a person to be more negatively affected by these conditions would be their physical fitness, their size. Someone who's extremely thin or obese could be more susceptible to heat stress. Lack of acclimatization. I can't say that word. Kate did it very well. A person's age and hydration. We'll come back to that in a minute. What they eat or drink throughout the day, or even the day before. Alcohol and drug use could very negatively affect a person's well-being in the heat. Prescription medications, drinking things like coffee and tea or other fluids that are known to be diuretics in some way, shape, or form that would cause us to lose fluids in various ways. And then any other illnesses or diseases a person might be experiencing could be a problem for them and cause them to become more susceptible to heat exhaustion. So those are some things that, we can't necessarily ask everyone their personal issues. Some things we can see, some things we might know. Hey, I heard you were sick, or you told me you were sick last week. Are you still taking any medication? If you might want to think about, taking care of yourself today. Did you ask your doctor about how this would affect heat stress? Some antibiotics. I remember as a kid seeing labels that say stay out of the sun when you take certain medications. So consider that when you come out of the doctor's office. Should I be working in a high heat environment, or should I take extra protection? Those are all things that we can convey from supervision, management, foreman down to the workers. And also, anybody who would be expected to be a first aid responder, have those conversations. All right, you hit the next slide for me. Thank you. Okay, so again, if a worker experiences these things, the foreman, the supervisor can recognize this, coworkers, see somebody, hey, oh, man, I really got a headache today, or they just don't seem as with it. They're weak or dizzy. That you walk around the job site and you see a couple of people with huge sweat stains that you don't normally see. Some people sweat. I sweat when it's 50 degrees, so I really can't win in that regard. But some people don't, and it's very obvious that they are over sweating because of the conditions. So we need to take account for that. The color of their skin, back of your hand on someone's forehead or cheek. Say, hey, you're not looking so good. Is it okay if I touch you? And if you feel that heat, then that's definitely something to take into consideration and move them to a safer area. Thirst. One thing I'd like to say about thirst, I bring this up in all my first aid classes and some of the other classes I teach. When you're sitting at home and maybe you're watching TV or just hanging out at your house, you feel thirsty, you get up, you find something to drink, you take some sips, no big deal. All right. When you're at work, and you are working, you're sweating, you're moving, you're in the high heat, and when you start to feel thirsty, you're already on the path of dehydration, and it's going to take you a while to catch up. So going back to what we were saying about prevention, you don't want to get to the point that you feel thirsty, right? So that's something you foremen and supervisors walking around, you're asking people, hey, when was the last time you had something to drink? And you hear these words, I'm not thirsty. That's not the question. The question is, when's the last time you had something to drink? And encourage people to do that more and more often on those days, because we don't want people to get to the point where they are thirsty, because that's not good. It could be too late in some cases. And it sounds gross to talk about, but how often is a person going to urinate? All right, that has a lot to do with the fluids that are within our body. If certain medications cause people to urinate more often, and eventually they're not going to be able to because those fluids are gone. We're sweating a lot, same thing. We're pushing those fluids out in places around our body for sweat, and then we don't have the urine output. That's just a sign that tells us, hey, look, we're decreasing our fluids somehow. So at these points, we want to get someone to a cooler place. Some of the things that Kate mentioned earlier, shade. Can we get someone in the truck with the air conditioner on? Can we get fans move, air movement somehow? If you've got, in a pinch, if you've got fans for confined spaces and things of that nature, turn them all on and use them to blow onto people who are sitting in a chair. Don't just leave those things sitting off in the corner. Oh, well, that's for a different job. Use them. They're already there. Get that air movement somehow, moving somehow. And some other things, keep an eye on that person. If you're going to sit them down or move them because of heat related issues, don't take your eye off them. Put someone with them to keep an eye, because they could decompensate and become unconscious. We don't want to get to the point where we've left someone alone and now they're in a state they can't take care of themselves. All right. And if at any point you're not sure, is this person going to recover? Are we doing the right thing? Call 911. It does not hurt to call 911 and get someone out there just in case there could be a serious medical emergency. All right. If you do actually have signs of a medical emergency, slurred speech, abnormal thinking or behavior, seizures. Now, seizures could be anything from unresponsiveness, a person just staring off into space and they don't interact with you at all. You wave your hand in front of their face, they don't even look at your hand or anything, all the way up to violent movements while in a chair or falling onto the floor, and definitely loss of consciousness. Any loss of consciousness, that is absolutely a medical emergency that we should get 911 involved with, if not already. All right. If we can cool this person immediately, and we're talking about heat stroke here, if we have the capability of using cold water You know, if we've got an unlimited supply of cold water, if we can get ice, if we can pack ice bags around this person or put them in some type of tub or tank that's available on site and get them submerged in cold water. Because like I said, heat stroke is knocking on death's door. One problem you might have is someone who's unconscious. Obviously, we want them to have fluids, but we can't just pour water in their mouth. If they can't swallow, they're going to choke. So please don't do that. I've seen that a few times. That's not going to help them. But yeah, if we can get ice or cold water on this person, or wet towels or rags, you know, now I realize sometimes job sites are out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have access to some of that stuff. So, you know, maybe that's something to keep in mind for, you know, those weather reports. We find out it's going to be 100 degrees tomorrow. Maybe we should have a cooler full of ice sitting back somewhere just in case for those people. And like I said, just constant communication and talking with all the workers to watch for those changes. All right, next slide, please. So again, it might seem gross, but another thing we can tell workers about is when they do urinate, what does their urine look like? These fluids that we're passing along. And they might be a little hard to see in a porta-john on a job site, but basically the darker our urine is, the more dehydrated we are. All right. Now, the worst case would be we're not urinating, right? Below that would be very dark urine. If you see at number 5 and 6 there, very, very dehydrated, severely dehydrated. You want your urine to be as clear as possible. The point of urinating is to flush out contaminants in the body. So our contaminants are at a low level when our urine is more close to clear, right? All right, so that's something we can show that little scale to our workers. So, you know, we tell people if your urine's getting darker, you need to drink more water, and not only drink more water, but drink more often. I mentioned earlier about, you know, when you're thirsty, it could be too late. When you know you're going to be working in a hot environment, you know, indoors, outdoors, whatever. You know, the numbers that Kate was talking about earlier. One thing to encourage workers to do is start drinking and sipping water as soon as they get up in the morning. You know, from the time they get up until the time they actually start swinging that shovel, you know, hopefully it's like an hour and a half to 2 hours. By the time you get up, shower, grab a breakfast, get dressed, get out the door, drive to work, have your morning meeting, gather your tools. If you've been sipping water that whole time, you're probably going to be in good shape. But if you wait all that time and start drinking 5 minutes before you start, you know, shoveling or heavy work is, you're probably going to be behind the 8 ball. All right. And then you're going to wonder why your urine is dark and you're not feeling so good a couple hours later. So always, always, always encourage workers to start drinking water as soon as they get up in the morning. Absolutely. Start that, not guzzle one, but just start sipping on it, you know, a bottle an hour, all right, before work. Another question I get a lot of times is energy drinks. Energy drinks are okay. A lot of them are full of sugar, and that doesn't necessarily help us very much, and some other stuff. There's a lot of hydration powders on the market these days that have no sugar. Some of them don't even, a lot of them have flavors, but some of them have no flavoring. That's some good stuff you can add to water throughout the day. But you can actually overload yourself on electrolytes. I've seen people pound sports drinks in the morning, and that doesn't necessarily help you very much. Some of those, because of all the chemicals in them, they might actually cause you to urinate a little bit more than you normally would. Some of them are even caffeinated, which doesn't make sense to me, but it is what it is. Right. And I think that's it. So just to reiterate, coming right from OSHA, water, rest, and shade. Keep it available, keep it ready, and be prepared. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, Drew. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Kim,
I
we
have
have
some
some time
questions
for
for you guys.
questions.
Yeah, I have questions for you all. Okay, so one of the questions was, is that acclimatization period only if the heat index is above 80 for the entire 14 days?
Oh, that's a really good question. It is, well,
I-
the part of it, with the acclimatization, it's 5 to 14 days, depending on the heat measurements that you're getting. And you want to basically kind of give yourself that look ahead, and come up with your plan. It's more about having a plan to acclimatize everyone. Now, if it's around 80 degrees, if there's one day that's 75, you're still going to be acclimatizing people, right? Even if it's not consistently 80 degrees. But once
Yeah,
it
you'll still
hits,
get there. You'll
yeah,
still get there.
yeah. So it's really about looking at what the weather's going to be like and writing that schedule for you and your workers based on what that looks like.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kate and Drew.
Sure.
All right, some other questions are, is the app that you showed in the presentation a US based only, or can it be used internationally?
I have not taken it to Europe to see if it works there. I don't know. Drew, do you know?
I couldn't say. I mean, it's if it's based off of standards, then it would be US only. But if it's based off of, best practices, then I don't see why it wouldn't be helpful anywhere.
Yeah, same.
It looks like somebody in the chat responded US based only.
Okay. Yeah, that one
And,
I didn't know that. Sorry
and
about that.
going back to the acclimatization, they want to know where they can find that chart.
For the heat stress chart?
The acclimatization chart. Is there a chart for that?
Mm, what I'm trying to find for everybody is what NIOSH recommends for heat acclimatization, and I'm gonna try to put that in. I'm gonna put that in the chat.
Okay.
It,
I
it really depends on the level of effort that they're going to be doing. It depends on the acclimatization really depends on the heat that's present, the clothing and PPE that your employees are going to wear, and then the level of effort and the type of work that they're doing. So it's not like there's a one size fits all chart for that. And then, so for instance, if the work that you're doing involves shoveling all day, you're not going to have people shovel all day that first day one, right? You're going to have them doing that a little bit each day, resting, maybe doing some other things, right, that aren't as labor intensive, and then gradually increase that level of effort until the last day where people are at 100% effort, if that makes
Yeah, you
sense.
you had mentioned something earlier with alternate measures like job rotation. Have a couple of guys shoveling for 15, 20 minutes and then swap them out. You don't have to have the same guy, the same person all day long doing the same thing. You can rotate that. We do that a lot with chemical exposure as well. Just limit the exposure. Someone else goes in and everyone's got a small exposure well below the requirements, and then we can move on there.
All right, and thank you. Someone is posting in the chat some of the links to some of the things we're discussing right now, so thank you. But some other questions. Does essential worker exemption include state and local government employees such as highway workers, highway construction workers, etc.?
No. If you look at it, means that it's work in connection with an emergency that requires involvement of law enforcement, emergency medical services, firefighting, rescue and evacuation operations. The only time I could maybe confined space rescue, maybe. or emergency restoration of essential utilities or telecommunications. That is specifically who that applies to.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
I would say that there could be some state workers, state highway workers that are connected to the emergency response. So for example, law enforcement or fire services need um, uh, state workers on the highway for an emergency. So that there are designated emergency responders, quote unquote, with state agencies. So that would probably follow that protocol there.
Yeah, thanks, Drew.
All right, thank you. The next question was, how does the NIOSH app differ from the AIHA heat app? Do you know that
I
answer?
haven't looked at the AIHA Heat app yet. Thank you for letting us know that that is available. I would imagine that I would imagine that they are similar because NIOSH follows ACGIH pretty closely for their recommendations, but I would have to look into that. The other thing I wanted to say too is that we have a checklist for you. It's about, I think, 2 pages so that you can check off and just make sure that you've got all the elements present in your programs. So when we'll send that out with the link to this webinar, and we'll put in those additional resources for you as well. So you'll get sort of a little email packet after this is over. Hopefully
Great.
that'll help.
Okay, going on down. You mentioned training with documentation. We are a GC with 1 superintendent on a job with 1 to 10 subcontractors on the site at any given time, with workers coming and going all the time. What is our responsibility to train the subs, and what would the documentation look like?
So it's the employers who have to train their employees, and that would kind of, I think, depend on how your subs are, are they your employees? Are they other people's employees? And the training, what you need to have there is all the things that I had in that slide. It doesn't really go over, it's very much employer-employee based, the standard. So how that is managed on large construction sites, I think will have to be
Yeah, a lot of
job to
times when you look
job.
at responsibility, the question is
Right?
who are
That's a hard one for me to answer because I'm not the,
yeah. The question is going to be who are the actual workers reporting to? If they're reporting to their
Yeah.
own, their own supervisors and foremen, then it's that company's individual responsibility. If they are reporting directly to the GC, then it's going to end up being the GC's responsibility. So if not, if each individual company is responsible under the GC, then the GC is just basically going to monitor hey, look, do you have everything that you need to have? Maybe even show evidence, give me a copy of it so I have it on file. But ultimately, it's going to be on whoever the employees are reporting to.
yeah.
Okay. Are there any requirements in the standard for physiological monitoring, BP, pulse, etc.? If not, what are your thoughts on providing devices to exposed workers like a portable blood pressure cuff?
I think if you're going to use those, put that in your program, that's one of the ways that you're monitoring everyone. That you have to put provisions in there for that, and if that's one of the things that you're going to do, that's great. Drew, what do you
Yeah, I
think
mean,
about
I don't
that?
remember seeing anything in the state plan that requires that. However, one thing I would caution you, because I've seen this many times, companies go out and buy fancy equipment and they just put it in the bag and throw it in the floor in the middle of the job site and say, hey, look what we got. If you don't train people how to use it or understand what it means when they find certain things, and if you don't describe when and how it's to be used and have it in your plan, then you've done nothing. You might even be citable for something for providing it without training. But yeah, that's absolutely a great idea. Just make sure you have a plan that describes when and how you're going to use it, who's going to use it, and what happens when you find certain things. So that's going to require some extra training, certification in some cases. Your first aid trained individuals might need an advanced first aid, or you might need to hire a company that will say, like an events company that would send EMTs or nurses to your site um, during certain conditions. So, but yeah, those things are out there and they're great. But if we don't know how to use them properly, they're kind of worthless.
Okay, one of the other questions, going back to acclimatization.
I can't say it either.
One of the things that comes up, this is from somebody saying that in their safety committees, they wanted to know, do we send people home if we don't have other work? They want your input on that, I guess.
I mean, again, I think that really depends on your policies.
Yeah, that's the decision. That's a company decision.
Yeah. It's just that they should only be for the acclimatization period. And remember, this period is temporary, right? It's 5 to 14 days. You're going to increase their workload 20%, a maximum of 20% each day. So that's where you'll have to use those administrative controls, I think, and look at how everyone is scheduled around. It's a different way of scheduling everybody's work.
And actually, to that question, somebody did ask, what does that look like? What does no more than 20% exposure on day one mean?
So the best way that I can describe it is by talking about running and mileage training plans, because they kind of have the same thing. So if you're training for a race, you don't go out and run 50 miles every week starting at day one, right? You're going to start at maybe 10 miles a week, 12 miles a week, and then increase your effort over a long period of time. So for instance, so if you were running 30 miles one week, you wouldn't, you can add up to 20% mileage for the next week and efforting, right? So you might start slow, work in some speed work. Kind of the same thing with like construction. You're not going to have people, again, doing very physically heavy tasks. You're going to balance that out a little bit. And look, when we're talking about 20%, think about time and think about how much time they're doing those larger, more intensive activities and increase the time 20% for that
Okay.
acclimatization schedule. If that helps. Does that help?
Well, I didn't ask the question, I just relayed the
Okay.
question.
Okay.
Hopefully that helped them, but,
Okay.
but going, and staying on the topic of acclimatization, somebody just asked, and said, our highway crews work year round outdoors, do they acclimatize organically, or do they need to follow a schedule?
Yeah, you still want to follow the schedule because the heat comes on gradually, right? So when we know it's starting to get hot, that's when we want to start acclimatizing everybody to the heat. So yeah, even though they're outside all year, you still do need to acclimatize.
Yeah, years ago, it seemed like spring slowly ramped up the heat into summer, but the past few years, we go from winter to summer like overnight sometimes. So it's going to be a little bit tougher.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Okay, and so we have a couple people asking if this standard applies to vehicle. Somebody asked about vehicle repair shops. Somebody else asked about K-12 schools in their buildings. Does this apply to all of those type of people?
Yeah, it's indoors and outdoors. So yes, it
Okay,
applies inside or outside.
Well, as long as it's, but unless you can maintain.
Right,
uh,
unless you have ventilation, air
Right. So I
conditioning.
would imagine a school would not be a problem.
Unless you don't have air conditioning, that might be.
That
Not
is
all
true.
schools are temperature controlled.
true. Okay. Are there any exceptions, any small business exceptions? Are there any exceptions to this standard? Other than what you mentioned in the beginning?
The exceptions are the emergency work. And if buildings, structures, vehicles have a mechanical ventilation system or fan that maintains the heat index below 80 degrees. So those are
Okay.
our exceptions.
And I know you mentioned training. Is there, if there's changes to their process or protocols as a result of this standard, do they need to, are they required to share this with their employees? What's that protocol?
Yes, the training, there's some specific things about training. That is, again, that one, everybody who is exposed to heat needs to be trained. There is a list of what needs to be included in the training. And when we send out, again, I have a checklist that has all of those components to the training session that needs to be there. So you can check off that you have instruction for all of those items.
Okay, and Kate, going along with the checklist and the other things that we're going to send, is there a generic plan that, a template that we could send along with it? Somebody, do we have, is there one out there?
So I haven't seen a sample plan, but what I did was I took the standard and made a checklist out of it because some of these decisions are going to be decisions that you have to make for your workplace and for your employees. So that's why I created a checklist versus a sample plan. For instance, how are you contacting emergency services? Where's the water going to be stored? What does your acclimatization plan look like? That's really going to be individual to what you're doing, what your project is, where your site is, what the conditions are like indoors.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, the checklist should hopefully be as helpful as a sample plan, I hope.
A couple more questions. People are mentioning about federal guidelines, OSHA's proposed guidelines for OSHA and when they might come out. Do we expect them to align with what MOSHA already has put out?
I would expect so. The feds just extended the comment period for their heat stress standard, so you can go and read it and comment. And that is what I know Fed-wise.
So somebody's saying they're hesitant to start making their plan based on the Maryland guidelines if the federal guidelines are gonna come out and be different.
To that, I would say that the Maryland plan is already in effect and enforceable. And so I would, if you're doing work in Maryland, 80 degrees or more heat index wise, indoors or outdoors, this is a requirement, a current requirement.
Okay. And then they want to know if somebody asked, does MOSH have a legal definition and standard for ventilation?
Ooh, that's a good question. The ventilation that they have here, the ventilation that they talk about is a mechanical ventilation system or fan. So it can be either HVAC or fans. And that ventilation system has to keep the heat index below 80 degrees. That is pretty much what is defined with regards to ventilation. And then the shade also is defined, right? Open on 3 sides, large enough for everybody to sit, store their PPE, and rest.
Okay.
So that's what's specifically defined in the standard. Good question.
Okay, 2 more questions that I think we have time for. One is there any oh my gosh, I can't speak.
It's okay, I know.
Is there on level work performed versus light versus moderate versus heavy?
So this standard doesn't specifically say that, but the ACGIH heat standard does have those provisions. And so you can kind of look at that standard, or, it's not a standard necessarily, it's a health standard, right? That's in the TLV book for ACGIH. Unfortunately, that is a proprietary standard, so you do have to purchase that. My guess is you can probably find that online. for free a little bit. But yeah, they do talk about different levels of clothing and looking at the work and like what is considered light duty work, what's considered medium duty work, what's considered heavy work. I didn't want to get too far into that because we're talking about the Maryland standard here, but there are some guidelines there in both the NIOSH and the ACGIH provisions for those recommendations or guidelines.
Okay.
I would say to that, come to the ready to work class.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, and then our final question is regarding acclimatization period for an employee who sits under an umbrella versus an employee who does physical work. They give the example of a lifeguard. Does that 20% still apply, for instance, when a heat wave comes?
Oof. Well, I think it depends on how hot is it going to be, how quickly does it get hot, how did you acclimatize that person, right? Their acclimatization might only be a couple days because they're sitting in the stand, and if they have to do anything, they're diving into the water, right? So
Well,
it
the other
really
thing is
just
they don't sit there all day. They
right.
rotate out and they're doing other physical activities, moving equipment and all kinds of other stuff that you don't necessarily see. So that may not be a good representation there. But yeah, they're going to have to fall under the same thing. They're just
Yeah.
going to get through it quicker.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that ends our question, and I have all the questions copied, and so we can send out the responses to those questions as well when we send out everything else.
Sure. Yeah. And thanks everyone for attending today. Pretty great.
That's awesome.
Thanks,
Well
everybody.
done. Thank you, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all in January for our next webinar. And like I said, this has been recorded and we'll get the presentation and the checklist and the presentation all uploaded to the website in just a few days. Hope you all have a safe and wonderful weekend and a good holiday season, okay? Stay cool. Yeah. Okay. Thanks all. Be well.